Our next guest today is George Sfinas from Stand Australia. Thank you so much, George, for joining us today. Please introduce yourself and go through your presentation. If you can make your presentation 15 to 20 minutes would be great, so we can also have 5-10 minutes time for some questions and answers and discussion. Over to you, George. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. And actually, fortunately, my presentation shouldn't be too long, so we definitely will have some time for discussion. My name is George Sfinas. I'm an engagement officer at Standards Australia in the building and construction sector. Thanks again, Ali, and the working group for inviting me today. I'll just share my screen. Is that fine? Can you see that? Perfect. Thank you. It's a shame I can't see you all now, but I guess we have to make do with the technology. But thank you. So I guess this slide here isn't just us. We are the country's leading independent, non-governmental, not-for-profit standards organisation. Obviously, as we've touched on already, standards ensure goods and services are fit for purpose, reliable, and do the job they're intended for. But this slide isn't just us. It represents the larger conformance infrastructure of Australia. Standards are just one component in this complex ecosystem of building policy, regulation, and codes. We work quite closely with the ABCB, who you can see over on I guess, represented on the left-hand side of the slide, to ensure that our standards assist with the implementation of building policy. But we don't just develop standards for regulation. We've got lots of other standards that are inherently voluntary. So proposals. The best way to action change is to submit a proposal. Proposals can be submitted to initiate a new standard, or as well as revise or amend older standards. And as I will mention just in a few slides, it's not just standards we do. There are also some other lower consensus documents such as technical specifications and handbooks. But there's three main considerations of proposals. The first one is a clear project scope. This includes what we refer to in the proposal form as the need for the work. So you're expected, I guess, to provide evidence of a problem and how a new standard or how a revision to an existing standard will solve the problem. You also need the scope itself. So if it's for a new document, a new standard, technical specification or handbook, we'd like to see a sort of contents page approach where we look at the main sections that comprise the new standard or the new publication. If it's for a revision or an amendment to a standard, the scope should just pinpoint exactly what will change in the standard as a result of the project. Any international standards. So if there's an international standard, and by international standard, we usually mean ISO, and obviously Standards Australia is the Australian member of ISO, we would prefer to adopt, either identically adopt or do a modified adoption of an international standard instead of carrying out a project with an older Australian standard. If, for example, this is for a revision or an amendment, or if it is seen that there's an existing international standard where we can adopt instead of going for a new, opting for a new standard, we'd also do that. This is just in the interests of international alignment and harmonisation of global standards, but we do acknowledge that there may be some standards where the Australian conditions are quite unique, and we still need to proceed with an Australian standard. The second consideration in the middle there of the slide is the net benefit case. So the proposal is expected to outline and summarise the net benefit the standard will, or the new standard or the revision or amendment of an existing standard will have on those 5 criteria. So public health and safety, social and community impact, environmental impact or effects on competition or trade, and the economic impact. And the third consideration is broad stakeholder support. So in order for a proposal to be approved by Standards Australia and our internal approval body, it must have broad stakeholder support. A proponent who submits a proposal is more than welcome to garner that support, but alternatively, we're also able to assist and circulate it to any relevant technical committees or other stakeholder groups or organisations that we have existing relationships with. There are a range of stakeholder interest categories which we sort of look at to sort of have that broad support. So on the screen, you can see organisations who we classify as manufacturers associations. We've obviously got government departments, testing bodies. Others include sort of universities and research and academic organisations, professional and technical bodies, and even sort of consumer or community groups. We've changed. So, as Martin sort of alluded to in the presentation, we do have a bit of a reputation for being old-fashioned and slow. Our standards, I think, used to take on average sort of 7 to 8 years to develop. We've really tried to streamline our processes and actively project manage sort of the change. And now, on average, standards take on average 18 months to 3 years. Which I acknowledge is still a long time, but we are trying to bring down the time to develop standards. But as flagged earlier, we don't just develop standards because we've acknowledged, and you all know, it's quite time consuming. We've also increased our focus on the speed to market solutions. So things such as technical specifications and handbooks, which we classify as lower consensus documents and can be used as guidance for industry. They might be purely informative guidance documents, or they might even act as an interim measure, almost like an interim standard in new fields where standardization hasn't been previously undertaken. And I guess we do call it low consensus, as developing national consensus on standards is a structured and very time-consuming process. But we've obviously identified the fact that we're either normative or informative technical documentation can be provided outside of standards. So the two the two main ones, which I think will be of interest to this group, are technical specifications and handbooks. A technical specification is a normative document that has been subject to a limited form of transparency and does not have the support of the full consensus process normally associated with an Australian standard. So by consensus, and for those of you who have been involved in the standards development process, you'll know that as part of the standards development process, there is a mandatory 9-week public consultation process that doesn't occur for both technical specifications and handbooks. It's subject to a peer review process by a group of experts in that field. And a technical specification, which we I guess colloquially referred to as a tech spec, could be prepared in a field where the subject matter or the regulatory environment is undergoing rapid change, or there is an emphasis on speed to delivery rather than the full consensus that standards usually experience as part of the process. And in some cases, a technical specification is developed first before an Australian standard is eventually developed to supersede the technical specification. Another possible application for a technical specification is where the required level of stakeholder consensus itself is just not possible. While handbooks usually meet that need of lower consensus, sometimes it is in the national interest for the information or the matter, the subject matter, to be better provided via a technical specification. And as I mentioned, it is subject to at least limited peer review with the option going to full public comment if it's deemed worthy by the committee or the working group that works on it. A handbook. So a handbook is an informative document. So note, obviously in the slide there, we've got technical specifications tend to be normative. Handbooks tend to be informative documents that may be used to support a standard or a group or a series of standards. It can aid, just based on that, it can aid the implementation or provide additional information or commentary to users. In some circumstances, a handbook may be produced where there's no standard, and one possibility is to publish a handbook, engage a reaction, and seek comment on that in a new field, and depending on the feedback, determine whether sort of a full consensus standardization activities are warranted going forward. It's usually developed by in some cases it can be developed by a single author or a selected group of experts rather than a constituted technical committee. Technical specifications, I should have mentioned, are generally developed by those technical committees. And as with the technical specification, handbooks also are lower consensus, so they will at least go through a period of peer review, as opposed to the full sort of 9-week public comment period. A case study, which I'm sure will be of interest, is the geopolymer concrete. So based on a review of prior studies and from the needs of industry, it was identified that one of the highest priorities was the development of a specification, be it standard or a low consensus document, on geopolymer concrete. That include performance requirements, provision for use of in-state and local specifications, and more independent research on engineering properties and long-term durability. And it was identified that a major barrier to the adoption of geopolymer concrete in construction was the lack of long-term performance data. And this comes back to a point Martin made not long ago. It was planned that a handbook would document good practice for the use of geopolymer concrete, help to overcome obviously the current barriers of this sort of innovative technology, and provide a pathway for increased use of low carbon geopolymer concrete in Australia. And in 2018, Standards Australia approved a proposal for a new handbook on geopolymer concrete. And my understanding is that project itself was a handbook. It's now a technical specification, and it will be available, I've been told, by the project manager of the committee, in the first, or hopefully the first quarter of 2022. So not long, hopefully. How can you be involved? So as I mentioned, the key way you can be involved in action change is through a proposal. If you've got a suggestion for change in any existing standards, or if you do identify the need for, I guess, a new standard or a new specification, anyone can submit a proposal to us if there's that need for the work, and we can then run it as a project with a project manager under a technical committee, if that is what's required. And of course, as subject matter experts, you can also get involved through the work of our technical committees and the working groups, which often work under technical committees or report to those technical committees. So they're the two main ways you can be involved in standards development. And that's essentially it. I mean, the slide there is for questions, but we can always easily segue into a discussion on possible opportunities and any sort of pathways that the industry sort of has identified for standards development opportunities.
Thank you so much, George, for a very informative presentation. I think that there are a few elements in that was quite good to know and understand, and it's good to know that the process has been improved. So now it takes only between 18 to 3 years. So that's a very good improvement. I think that we can have a few questions here. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Just have a question myself, George. So the email that you mentioned is the email for the proposal, or how's the procedure, or is
Yeah,
it like an online form that is?
It's a good question, and it is sort of the Standards Australia engagement team joint sort of team email where proposals are usually sent to. But I'm happy to provide my personal email, considering I'm obviously in the sector, and if there are any opportunities, you're of course more than welcome to contact me. So I can provide my email, but also happy to stay in touch with this.
Sure, thanks. Deck, please.
Thanks so much. Just a question on standards or documents, I should say, produced by standards and normative and informative references. If you say like have a code or a handbook, which is informative. It still is like a guide. So in the absence of a standard or any particular contract, it's still deemed to be like best practice. And so I suppose when is something really normative and when is something really informative? Because if I've got a standard, for example, on the geopolymer, and I do something different, the fact is that the standards handbook is actually quite useful in terms of, and is it normative? I mean, where do you draw the line, George?
I'm so sorry. I
Yes,
completely
I'm just
froze and
sorry.
I lost my internet, and
Yeah.
I just caught the tail end of that question.
Yes, so I'm trying to work
Sorry,
out
Victor.
when your documents, like when you say they're informative and normative. Now, normative are like standards and things that go into contract and you conform. But something like even like the example you mentioned about the geopolymer concrete, if I'm supplying concrete and there's a reference of Standards Australia handbook, or and usually done in conjunction with, I don't know, CCAA or someone, it's fairly high level. So therefore, doesn't it have some legal precedence in contract?
Yes, no, that you are correct. It does have legal precedence, and when it's all said and done, it is a Standards Australia document.
Yeah.
And I obviously, without being involved in the nuts and bolts of the project, the sort of where the project manager was dealing with it, I believe that's where the pivot from handbook to tech spec sort of went along those lines. As I mentioned, handbooks do tend to be they do tend to accompany standards, and they do tend to provide commentary to a standard or a series of standards, and that's where I think the majority of handbooks that's their purpose. So anything that's sort of if the intention is for something to be normative, a technical specification would be sort of what you'd be looking for if you were looking for a speed to market solution, and obviously a full standard if you don't mind waiting the time. Unfortunately, I know it does take a long time. As I mentioned, we are definitely trying to cut down that time. 3 years I think is still too long. So I think there's definitely scope to actually even cut it down to below 3 years, and hopefully even shorter than that.
I can ask another question, George. So you said that for proposal, it needs to have some kind of consensus behind that. So it cannot be like from single person or probably a couple of person to just apply for a proposal or changes or new standards or handbooks. So what are the criteria? So is it a number of people, a number of organizations? So how do you set the criteria so it can go through the next level?
It's a great question, Ali, and it's something where even internally we don't have a criteria. We don't have a certain sort of number that we have to hit. There's no sort of number of stakeholder interest categories that have to be involved. Generally, I guess we have a good sense of when we know there's sort of broad industry support for a proposal, and I think the fact that Standards Australia uses those stakeholder interest categories is that representation from all different parts of industry. So I think when we can sort of point to as a rule of thumb, sort of 7 or 8 of those stakeholder interest categories, and possibly even more. That's when we know that there's probably a lot of the interested and impacted stakeholders who have supported this work, that it can go ahead.
David, please.
Oh, look, just a comment. I did post something on the conversation, but I think it's just worth mentioning the recent experience that BD31 had in developing the new manufactured pozzolan standard. And that's a new standard that will cover a range of materials, many of which we really don't even know how they will perform. But I think it's just a great test case of how quickly a standard can be developed, but there needs to be a will and determination on behalf of the committee to innovate, to embrace some degree of risk, but at the same time to balance that with a degree of prescription around absolutely non-negotiable items, because we don't want bridges collapsing. We don't want pavements failing. So I just try to emphasise that I think it can be done. And then as research and as field practice catches up or experience catches up with the use of those materials, then that standard goes through another process of, I don't want to say watering down, but moving towards a more performance-based standard. So it can be done, but we just need to balance the risk with a bit of prescription to ensure that we don't have any unintended consequences.
Yeah, thanks, David. And you touched on a few points there. I think the committee is definitely one aspect, and I think when we are talking about lower consensus documents, we often, they're often developed in working groups or sort of subcommittees that sit under technical committees, and that way we can actually get sort of more interested or very directly interested stakeholders actually drafting those. So that's definitely one big advantage. And the other thing I just want to quickly touch on is also in the proposal. If any sort of stakeholder submitting a proposal, it comes with a very clear scope. And submits that very clear scope to Standards Australia, it does definitely lessen the scope creep that will happen afterwards. So, but great point, and I guess thanks for the real life example of BD 31.
Okay, thank you so much, George. I think that's all the question that the panel has. So again, thank you to you for joining us today, for your informative presentations and answering the questions of our working group members. And
Thanks,
I think that would be the end of our working group meeting today. I just want to point out for our next working group, we want to discuss further about what exactly our working group are going to do next year. So we need to have, we have a few good presentations, talks, discussion and everything, but we need to have some, I would say, tangible outcomes from our working group. So we will have a brainstorming session in our next meeting in December. So we set up some points, some of the things that you think that would be the main interest and should be the main outcome of our working group. And we set that out and we try to generate something tangible as an outcome of our working group, hopefully in 2022. So please tune in, and we will have our December meeting dedicated to that. And that's the end of our meeting. If you have any questions or comment, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks to our presenters today for joining us, and thank you to all of you to joining us today. Have a great evening.